Florida, 2001. A cold case finally solved after decades of heartbreak and mystery. Caleb Thomas Merritt, just 25 years old, was a quiet and hardworking auto parts warehouse technician, beloved by neighbors and known for restoring old muscle cars in his spare time. One humid August evening, Caleb vanished without a trace. His truck was later found idling by the roadside. Driver's door open, engine running, no sign of Caleb. What followed were years of anguish, missteps, and dead ends. Rumors swirled, tips dried up, and the case grew cold. But now, over 20 years later, a DNA breakthrough has shattered the silence. The arrest? No one in the community saw it coming. Before we begin, drop a comment with your country and the time right now. In the heart of Marion County, Florida, where the days are hot, the pine trees stretch tall, and the air smells faintly of orange groves and motor oil, lived Caleb Thomas Merritt. Ocala wasn't a place known for violent crime or media frenzy. It was a working-class town stitched together by family-run diners, weekend car shows, and neighbors who still waved at each other from their porches. Caleb was one of them, a quiet fixture in a quiet place. At 25, Caleb had carved out a simple life. He rented a small single-story home on a quiet cul-de-sac on the west side of town, just a 15-minute drive from where he worked at All Pro Auto Parts, a regional warehouse that supplied mechanics and body shops across Central Florida. He'd been there since graduating high school, rising from stockroom grunt to shift lead. His coworkers described him as dependable, never late, and always willing to swap shifts. But work wasn't Caleb's passion. Cars were. The real heartbeat of his life pulsed in the garage behind his house, where he and his Uncle Ray, a retired mechanic, spent hours under the hoods of old Chevrolets. Caleb loved vintage American muscle. He had a special fondness for 1960s-era Impalas, and he was slowly restoring one piece by piece, a project that, according to Uncle Ray, kept his soul humming. Grease-stained overalls and classic rock drifting through an old radio defined Caleb's weekends. He didn't go out much. He wasn't the type to party or draw attention. His friends were few but loyal. He was close with his younger sister, Megan, and still ate dinner at his parents' house every Sunday. His mother, Janice Merritt, described him as steady as a metronome. He didn't drink, didn't chase trouble, and didn't stray from his routines. Even his dog, a shepherd mix named Baxter, seemed to know Caleb's schedule down to the minute. Despite his modest means, Caleb had plans. He was saving up to buy a newer truck, and he'd just started looking at houses in nearby Bellevue. He wanted to settle down. There were whispers he had been seeing someone, a woman from the salvage yard he frequented, but nothing serious had ever been confirmed. He was private, guarded even, but not withdrawn. Caleb's life was one of rhythm, reliability, and hard work. That's what made what happened next so deeply unsettling. On the surface, there was no reason for anything to go wrong. He had no enemies, no criminal record, no addictions or dangerous habits. Yet something, or someone, was about to shatter everything. On the night he vanished, Caleb was expected to meet Uncle Ray early the next morning to finish welding a new frame piece on the Impala. He never showed. Calls went unanswered. By noon, his family was worried. By sunset, panic had set in. People don't just vanish in Ocala, especially not someone like Caleb Merritt. For his mother, the idea that her son, the same boy who once cried when he ran over a squirrel, had simply driven off and disappeared, didn't make sense. It didn't add up, but the truth was something had interrupted his routine that night. Something had pulled Caleb away from the safety of his home, the hum of his tools, the comfort of his quiet life, and whatever that something was. It would set off a chain of events that would plunge the Merritt family, and the entire town, into 2 decades of grief, speculation, and silence. What could have pulled Caleb from his routine and into the unknown that night? August 3, 2001, was a typical sweltering Friday in Central Florida. The humidity clung to everything, and thunderheads loomed on the horizon as Caleb Merritt ended his shift at All Pro Auto Parts. Warehouse logs showed he clocked out at precisely 6:12 p.m. According to co-workers, Caleb was in good spirits that day. He'd just received a call that a rare carburetor part he'd been hunting might have surfaced at a salvage yard 20 minutes east of town. He told a friend he planned to stop by and check it out before heading home. That would be the last confirmed sighting of Caleb alive. When he didn't return calls later that evening, no one panicked. Not at first. Caleb was known for going off the grid when he got busy with a project. But when midnight came and went with no sign of him, and Baxter, his dog, was found pacing anxiously in the yard, concern turned to dread. By 1:45 a.m., local deputies responded to a call from a passerby who had seen a silver 1996 Dodge Ram sitting awkwardly on the shoulder of Pine Creek Road, a two-lane stretch surrounded by dense palmetto woods and cattle fencing. The truck's headlights were still on, its engine humming gently in the dark. The driver's door hung ajar, but there was no driver. Inside the vehicle, deputies found Caleb's wallet tucked in the glove box, along with his cell phone, an old flip model with a cracked screen. The keys were still in the ignition. There were no signs of a struggle. No blood, no footprints leading away. The scene was both ordinary and eerie, like someone had simply stepped out and vanished into the dark. Within hours, the Merritt family was on site. Janice Merritt, still in her house slippers, trembled as she gave the first formal missing persons report. Her voice, cracked and hoarse, was captured in the chilling 911 call she made at 3:17 a.m. "Please, something's wrong. My son wouldn't leave his truck like that. He wouldn't leave his dog." Search teams were quickly organized. Friends, co-workers, and neighbors fanned out across the nearby fields and wooded trails with flashlights and dogs. Volunteers combed ditches and drainage canals. Caleb's face was printed on missing person flyers by daybreak. For a town like Ocala, where nothing like this ever seemed to happen, it was a jarring wake-up call. Speculation began immediately. Some wondered if Caleb had broken down and wandered off looking for help, but the truck was in working order. Others whispered about robbery, even abduction. But who would target Caleb? He wasn't flashy, didn't carry much cash, and had no known enemies. Investigators treated the site as suspicious but were careful with their words. There was no evidence of foul play, but there was no evidence of anything else either. And that's what made it so chilling. By Saturday afternoon, local news had picked up the story. A young man vanishing without a trace, his vehicle still running on the side of a road. It was the kind of case that left people locking their doors for the first time in years. Yet despite the growing media attention and the community-wide search effort,
no one could offer a solid lead.
No witnesses, no surveillance footage, no footprints, just a truck, an open door, a night that refused to give answers. As day turned to dusk again, one question consumed everyone involved. What could explain Caleb's sudden disappearance without a trace? On the morning of August 7th, 4 days after Caleb Merritt vanished, a volunteer searcher named Dana Lopez spotted something unnatural in a shallow drainage canal, less than a mile from where Caleb's truck had been abandoned. It was early, barely 7:30 a.m., and the air was already thick with heat. Dana had been walking the same trail for the third day in a row, refusing to give up, when a glimpse of pale skin caught her eye through the cattails. She called the sheriff's tip line immediately. Within the hour, deputies had cordoned off the area. The canal, barely 2 feet deep due to recent drainage from a summer storm, ran parallel to an old utility access road. It wasn't a spot many frequented, overgrown, muddy, and easy to miss. Caleb's body lay face down, partially submerged, tangled in debris and overgrowth. Investigators quickly noted the grim details. Caleb's hands had been bound behind his back with a coarse nylon cord. His wrist showed signs of bruising and restraint. There were visible contusions to the side of his head and upper body, clear indications of blunt force trauma. The body was clothed in the same work boots and jeans Caleb had last been seen wearing. But one detail stood out above all. This area had already been searched, twice. Deputies had passed through the canal 2 days earlier with cadaver dogs and volunteers. It had been empty. This meant one thing. Caleb's body had been moved after his death. Someone had deliberately placed him there days after he'd been killed. The discovery triggered an immediate shift in tone. What had started as a missing person case was now officially a homicide investigation. The media swarmed. The sheriff's office held a press conference later that afternoon, confirming the identification and promising justice. "We will not rest until we know who did this to Caleb," Sheriff Donnie Platt said. Someone in this community knows something. The town was stunned. Grief mingled with fear. Who would do this to a man like Caleb, and why? At the autopsy, the medical examiner ruled the cause of death as homicidal violence, consistent with a blow to the head, possibly with a blunt object. Toxicology came back clean. There were no drugs or alcohol in Caleb's system. He had no defensive wounds, suggesting he'd been taken by surprise or incapacitated quickly. There were no obvious signs of sexual assault, but due to the body being submerged for several days in the stagnant canal water, much of the trace evidence, DNA, fibers, hair, had been compromised or lost entirely. Investigators knew the water had washed away their best chance at catching the killer. The community began to speculate. Theories swirled: a botched robbery, a jealous ex, a random act of violence. Some suspected someone Caleb knew, someone who could get close without raising suspicion. Others feared a stranger had chosen him at random, but the decision to move the body, to delay its discovery, added a chilling layer to the crime. It was calculated. It was intentional. Whoever did this wasn't acting in a moment of panic. They were thinking, planning, hiding. The case took on new urgency. The sheriff's office doubled down on interviews, searching for connections, for grudges, for anything Caleb might have gotten caught up in. But nothing about his life suggested a motive. He wasn't involved in crime. He had no known enemies. And so, a darker question began to take shape in the minds of the investigators and Caleb's family alike. Why would someone move Caleb's body? And what were they trying to hide? Following the confirmation of Caleb Merritt's death, the Marion County Sheriff's Office swiftly mobilized a task force. The community demanded answers. A young man had been killed brutally and left in a canal like a discarded object. The public outcry was loud, and law enforcement felt the pressure. Sheriff Donnie Platt assigned 10 investigators to the task force. Their first step: reconstruct Caleb's final movements. He had clocked out at 6:12 p.m. on August 3rd. The salvage yard he planned to visit was a 20-minute drive from his workplace, but employees there reported that Caleb never arrived. Somewhere in that narrow window, something happened. Detectives canvassed nearby roads and local businesses, requesting any surveillance footage. Gas stations, liquor stores, even a small roadside diner. But most either didn't have security systems or had already recorded over the tapes. Not a single camera captured Caleb's truck that night. Dozens of people were questioned. Co-workers described him as quiet and reliable, never one to stir up drama. Friends echoed the same. Caleb didn't have enemies, no outstanding debts, no criminal background, no exes with grudges. His life was shockingly clean, which only made his murder more perplexing. Then came the tips. An anonymous caller phoned in, naming a man, Ronald Ronnie Drake, a local ex-con who had once worked at the same warehouse as Caleb. Rumors said the two had argued months earlier over stolen tools. Investigators brought Drake in. He was volatile with a history of violence, including a prior assault conviction. But after hours of interrogation, no solid link to Caleb's murder emerged. His alibi checked out, and there was no physical evidence tying him to the crime scene. Another tip came from a woman who claimed she'd seen a dark sedan parked near where Caleb's truck was found. But she couldn't recall the license plate or even the make of the car. Leads like these gave detectives momentary hope, only to lead nowhere. The investigation dragged into September. Forensics processed every inch of Caleb's truck and clothing. Trace fibers, soil samples, tire impressions, everything was cataloged. But nothing definitive surfaced. The murder weapon, presumed to be some kind of blunt object, was never found. And most damning of all, no usable DNA. The canal water had washed away nearly every possibility of biological trace evidence. Frustration mounted within the task force. Investigators began re-interviewing those closest to Caleb, hoping something had been missed the first time. His mother, Janice, sat through 3 separate interviews, each more emotionally draining than the last. "I just want to know why," she told them. "Why my boy?" The sheriff's office released a public plea. "If you know anything, no matter how small, come forward." Tip lines were flooded, but most were noise. Psychic visions, baseless accusations, nothing they could act on. By November, leads had dried up. The task force was scaled down. The posters began to fade from storefront windows, and slowly the town began to move on. The Merritt family didn't. Caleb's bedroom remained untouched. His dog Baxter slept near the front door for months, waiting. His mother lit a candle every night in the kitchen window. Without witnesses, without evidence, and without direction, the case began slipping from headlines and memory. But the question refused to fade. As the holiday season approached, the silence surrounding Caleb's murder only grew more haunting. Would the killer ever be identified, or had they slipped away for good? By the spring of 2003, nearly 2 years after Caleb Merritt's murder, the investigation had grown silent. The whiteboard in the Marion County Sheriff's evidence room, once filled with names, timelines, and theories, had been erased. Leads had dried up. Detectives had moved on to newer cases, and what had once been a community-wide cry for justice had dwindled into quiet resignation. The file, labeled Merritt Caleb T. Homicide 2001, was officially reclassified as a cold case and sent to the archives. It was a clinical decision, procedural even, but to Caleb's family it felt like a burial of its own, the death of hope. Still, Janice Merritt refused to let her son's memory fade. Every year on Caleb's birthday, she and her husband visited the drainage canal where his body was found. They brought fresh flowers, replaced the small wooden cross that often got weathered by storms, and stood in silence. To them, that spot was sacred, the last place on earth that had known their son. But time has a cruel way of eroding attention. By 2005, the news had stopped mentioning Caleb's name. His story became just another unsolved Florida cold case, one of many. The few detectives who still remembered him spoke of the case with quiet frustration. There had been no motive, no weapon, and no forensic strong enough to point anywhere. Detective Linda Sykes, one of the original investigators, retired in 2006. Before she left, she mailed Janice a handwritten letter that simply read, "I still think of him. Don't give up." Janice kept it framed beside a photograph of Caleb holding Baxter, smiling under a summer sky. But the years that followed were heavy. Caleb's father passed away in 2012 after a long illness, never seeing justice for his son. His mother continued writing letters, to the sheriff's office, to local news outlets, even to the state attorney's office. Each year she asked the same thing: "Please, reopen my boy's case." Most replies were polite but brief. Limited resources. No new evidence. We'll review when possible. The Merritt home became a museum of frozen time. Caleb's room remained untouched. His work boots sat neatly by the door. His favorite flannel still hung on the back of a chair. Dust gathered, but nothing was moved. Janice said she couldn't bear to change it. "It's like he might walk back through the door any minute," she told a local reporter in 2015, when the story briefly resurfaced for the case's 14th anniversary. Neighbors had moved away. New families took their place, unaware that tragedy had once lived down the street. Yet Janice's house, with its flickering porch light and fading justice for Caleb sign, stood as a quiet reminder of what was lost and what still lingered unresolved. By 2020, the case had been inactive for nearly 2 decades. The physical evidence, Caleb's clothing, the bindings from his wrists, soil samples, sat sealed in boxes deep in the evidence vault. Technology had advanced, but no one had gone back to test it. Still, hope has a strange way of surviving even the longest winters. A new generation of detectives was beginning to revisit old cases using modern DNA techniques. Janice had heard about breakthroughs in other towns, cold cases decades old, suddenly solved with the smallest trace of evidence. She began to wonder if science might someday do what human persistence could not. As she sat by the window one night, the glow of the old porch light illuminating the photographs of her son, she whispered the same words she had spoken every year since 2001. "Someone out there knows. Would anything ever thaw this frozen case and bring answers to the Merritt family?" In the early months of 2022, the Marion County Sheriff's Office quietly announced the formation of a new cold case initiative. Led by a small but determined team of investigators and forensic analysts, the unit's mission was simple: revisit the department's most unresolved crimes using modern technology. Near the top of the list, Caleb Merritt. 2 decades had passed since Caleb was found face down in a drainage canal. His case file had collected dust, but the evidence had been preserved. carefully sealed and cataloged. Among those items, the bindings used to restrain Caleb's wrists. In 2001, forensic testing methods lacked the sensitivity to pick up what's now known as touch DNA, microscopic skin cells left behind on surfaces during physical contact. But in 2022, new techniques allowed analysts to extract and sequence even the faintest traces. When forensic technician Olivia Shaw re-examined the evidence, she found something promising: a partial DNA profile embedded in the twisted fibers of the nylon cord. It wasn't much, a few degraded markers, but it was enough to run through CODIS, the National Criminal Database. The result? No direct match. Still, Olivia had another tool: genetic genealogy. Using services like GED Match and Family Tree DNA, investigators began comparing the partial profile to public genetic databases. Within weeks, a hit came back, not to a suspect, but to a second cousin in Georgia who had submitted his ancestry for recreational purposes. It was a long shot, but it was the break they needed. Working with a genetic genealogist, investigators built a family tree from the match, tracing distant branches and mapping lines of descent. The process was painstaking, involving birth records, marriage licenses, and death certificates. But it eventually led them back to Florida, to Ocala, to someone local. The name that surfaced stunned everyone involved: Mitch Granger, a former tow truck driver who had once worked a salvage route that passed directly through the area where Caleb's truck was found. Granger had never been a suspect. He had no connection to Caleb on paper. He wasn't in the criminal DNA database, having never been arrested for a felony, but the timeline fit, and so did his history. Further digging revealed that in 2001, Granger had been operating independently, towing disabled vehicles for under-the-table cash. He often picked up parts from the same salvage yard Caleb had planned to visit that night. Witnesses recalled seeing Granger around that time, but no one had linked him to the case. Investigators discreetly obtained a sample of Granger's DNA from a discarded coffee cup outside a convenience store. When it was analyzed, the results came back within 72 hours. It was a direct match to the DNA on the bindings. After 21 years, they finally had something they'd never had before: forensic evidence tying someone to Caleb's murder. But the news brought more questions than answers. Granger had lived in Ocala the entire time, flying under the radar. He had no violent convictions, no obvious motive. He wasn't in Caleb's known circle. There were no recorded disputes between them. Had it been a random encounter? A robbery gone wrong? Or was there something deeper that no one had ever seen? As investigators prepared for the next step, surveillance, interviews, and possibly an arrest, they couldn't help but wonder, would this breakthrough finally point to the true killer, or just another dead end? On the morning of February 13, 2023, just as the Florida sun was beginning to cut through the fog along rural Ocala roads, law enforcement officials surrounded a small, weather-worn house at the edge of town. Inside, Mitch Granger, 49, was pouring his first cup of coffee when deputies from the Marion County Sheriff's Office knocked on his door. He didn't resist. Didn't run. In fact, neighbors later described him as calm as he stepped onto the porch in slippers and handcuffs. Granger, a former tow truck driver, had flown under the radar for more than 2 decades. He'd lived a quiet life in the years since Caleb's murder, working odd jobs, staying largely to himself, and keeping a low profile. To those who remembered him, he was helpful, polite, even forgettable. But the DNA match recovered from the bindings used on Caleb's wrists left no room for doubt. The partial profile, developed in 2022, had been confirmed with a direct sample investigators, discreetly collected from one of Granger's discarded items, and it was conclusive. He was charged with first-degree murder. As news of the arrest broke, the community reeled. People who'd grown up seeing Caleb's face on faded flyers were now adults with families of their own. Many had long assumed the case would never be solved, that Caleb's killer had disappeared, maybe even died, but he had been living among them all along. The arrest was shocking enough, but what came next was even more disturbing. During a court-approved search of Granger's property, investigators found a locked trunk buried beneath the floorboards of an old shed in his backyard. Inside were items that would send chills down the spines of even the most seasoned detectives. There were photographs, some of Caleb, candid and taken from a distance, apparently without his knowledge. They were dated weeks before the murder. There were also maps, including a hand-drawn sketch of Pine Creek Road with markings that corresponded to where Caleb's truck had been found and where his body was later discovered. Granger had kept mementos. He denied everything. In the interrogation room, he was quiet, almost expressionless. He didn't ask for a lawyer immediately. Instead, he stared at the table, barely acknowledging the evidence being presented to him. When finally questioned, Granger claimed he didn't know Caleb. "Never met him," he said. "Don't know what you're talking about." When asked about the photographs, he claimed they were planted, but the forensic evidence told a different story. The DNA, the photos, the maps, all of it pointed toward premeditation. For Caleb's family, the arrest was surreal. Janice Merritt, now visibly older but still sharp with grief, broke down in tears when detectives knocked on her door to share the news. "I thought I'd die before I ever heard his name," she whispered. "But now I know who." The town, once gripped by confusion and fear, now found itself asking new questions. What was Granger's motive? Why Caleb? And why hold on to those photos and maps for so long? As the legal process began to unfold, attention turned to the trial. Would Granger finally reveal the truth? Would he confess, offer an explanation, or take his secrets to the grave? What would Mitch Granger say in court? And would the truth finally come out? The state of Florida versus Mitchell Granger opened in a packed courtroom on November 18, 2024. News crews lined the courthouse steps, and inside every seat was filled. Law enforcement, local press, Caleb Merritt's family, and a community that had waited more than 2 decades for answers. Granger entered the courtroom in shackles, flanked by public defenders. He looked older, heavier, but unflinching. No emotion crossed his face as prosecutors laid out the case against him. The prosecution wasted no time building their narrative. They opened with the cornerstone, DNA. Forensic experts testified that the touch DNA recovered from the bindings used on Caleb's wrists, processed using modern techniques, matched Granger with over 99.9% certainty. The sample wasn't partial anymore. With newer equipment, they had been able to complete the profile. Then came the physical evidence. The trunk found in Granger's shed was introduced as Exhibit A. The prosecution revealed its contents. High-resolution photographs of Caleb, apparently taken without his knowledge. Hand-sketched maps of Pine Creek Road and the surrounding drainage area. And newspaper clippings from 2001, documenting the disappearance and eventual discovery of Caleb's body. But the most emotionally devastating moment came when Caleb's mother, Janice Merritt, took the stand. She held up the last photo taken of her son, a candid snapshot from the family's July 4th barbecue just weeks before his death. Her voice trembled as she described the years of unanswered questions, the weight of grief, and the moment she learned her son's killer had been living within miles of her home all these years. "I never stopped believing someone would say his name," she told the jury, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Now you know who he was, and now I know who took him." Granger's defense attorneys attempted to shift the narrative. They argued that the DNA evidence could have been contaminated in storage over the years. They claimed the photos and maps were circumstantial. Strange, yes, but not necessarily criminal. They suggested Granger was a hoarder, obsessed with local mysteries, not a killer. But the jury didn't buy it. After 3 weeks of testimony and 3 days of deliberation, the verdict came back: guilty of first-degree murder. The sentence: life in prison without the possibility of parole. There was no audible reaction from Granger. He didn't flinch. He didn't speak. He was led out in silence. For the Merritt family, the verdict brought relief, but also complexity. There was still no clear motive. Granger never confessed. He never offered an explanation. Why had he targeted Caleb? Had they crossed paths by chance, or had Granger been watching him? That question, why Caleb, lingered like a shadow. Yet in the eyes of the law, justice had been served. A man who had taken a life and lived in hiding for over 2 decades was finally held accountable. Outside the courtroom, Janice spoke to the press. "There's no closure," she said. "But there is justice. Caleb mattered. And now the world knows he mattered." The town of Ocala, once haunted by the memory of Caleb's disappearance, breathed differently after the trial. The porch lights that once symbolized hope were now lights of remembrance. But even as the prison doors closed behind Mitch Granger, one final question echoed across the courthouse steps. In the end, what legacy did this case leave behind for the town and Caleb's loved ones? In early 2025, beneath a sky streaked with soft Florida light, Caleb Thomas Merritt was laid to rest once again, this time with a new headstone and a sense of justice that had been 2 decades in the making. The simple granite marker read, Caleb Thomas Merritt, 1976 to 2001, never forgotten. The ceremony was quiet, attended by family, close friends, and a few of the original volunteers who had searched the woods and canals back in 2001. There were no speeches, only the soft sound of wind rustling through trees and the quiet sobs of a mother who had spent 22 years searching for her son's name to be cleared and his killer brought to justice. For Janice Merritt, justice hadn't erased the pain, but it had finally delivered peace. She no longer lived in a limbo of unanswered questions. Now she could begin to grieve the son she lost, not just the mystery that haunted him. The impact of Caleb's case extended far beyond his family. The successful resolution of the 2001 cold case became a statewide catalyst for reform. Lawmakers in Tallahassee introduced new measures for the preservation and re-examination of evidence in long-dormant investigations. These reforms mandated stricter chain-of-custody protocols and provided funding for the reanalysis of physical evidence. Using the latest in-touch DNA technology, Florida's cold case units, and often underfunded and understaffed, received a boost in resources. A new digital tracking system was introduced, allowing investigators to flag cases for periodic review when new technology becomes available. Caleb's case was cited as the prime example in multiple legislative hearings. His story also entered the world of law enforcement education. The Florida Department of Law Enforcement began using the Merritt case in its advanced forensics curriculum, showing how trace DNA, family genealogy, and persistence can collide to solve what once seemed unsolvable. Caleb's name now lives on in training materials, classroom discussions, and PowerPoint presentations for detectives learning to crack their own cold cases. But perhaps the most personal legacy was built quietly by Janice herself. In 2026, she launched the Caleb Merritt Foundation, a grassroots organization aimed at supporting families with missing or murdered loved ones. Its mission was clear: provide emotional support, connect families with investigative resources, and advocate for cold case funding. "I couldn't save my son," Janice told a local reporter during the foundation's launch event. "But maybe I can help another mother not wait 22 years for answers." The foundation began small, just a website, a donation page, and a few volunteers. But it quickly found traction. Other grieving families reached out, sharing their stories and finding strength in Janice's resolve. What started as a memorial became a lifeline. The town of Ocala, too, changed. The overgrown stretch of Pine Creek Road where Caleb's truck was found was eventually adopted by a local cleanup group and turned into a small memorial trail. A wooden bench engraved with Caleb's name now rests beneath the trees, inviting quiet reflection for those who pass by. For years, Caleb's life had been defined by his disappearance. But now his name was tied to resilience, reform, and a renewed belief in justice. His mother still visits his grave on his birthday. She brings a single red rose and sits in silence, not out of despair but out of love. Because in the end, though Caleb Thomas Merritt is gone, the pursuit of justice ensured something far greater than closure. It ensured that his story will never fade. The long, painful journey to justice in Caleb Thomas Merritt's case stands as a solemn reminder of the power of persistence and the critical role that evolving forensic science plays in solving the unsolvable. For over 2 decades, his family endured unimaginable silence. Not just the silence of grief, but the silence of unanswered questions. And yet they never gave up. Their steadfast belief that one day someone would listen, someone would care, and someone would act, was finally rewarded. From the moment Caleb vanished on that hot Florida evening in 2001, to the day the courtroom echoed with a guilty verdict, this case reminded a nation that every missing person is more than a file number. They are someone's child, someone's friend, someone whose story matters. The arrest and conviction of Mitchell Granger didn't just bring accountability. It brought clarity. It gave a name to the shadow that haunted a family for years. But beyond the merits, Caleb's case now breathes life into thousands of other cold case files sitting in boxes across the country. His story proved that no lead is too small, no evidence too old, and no victim too forgotten. Today, Caleb's memory fuels reform. It empowers new investigations. It teaches, and most of all, it gives hope. Justice came late, but it came. And for those still waiting in the dark, Caleb's legacy is a light, a promise that the truth can still find its way forward. If you believe every life deserves justice, share Caleb's story. Let his name live on.